What if I told you that by the end of this journey, everything you believe about reality might unravel? Picture yourself standing at the edge of understanding, where logic itself begins to fray. Welcome to the realm of paradoxes, where a truth becomes a spiral, and the more you try to grasp it, the more it slips through your fingers like quantum smoke. Imagine a universe where cause and effect dance in impossible loops, where the simplest questions lead to answers that devour themselves. These aren't just philosophical puzzles. They're gates to understanding the very fabric of existence, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. Some of these paradoxes are so profound that once you truly comprehend them, your mind might never see the world the same way again. Let's begin with the paradox of divine contradiction. Picture an all-powerful being who creates a lock so perfect that nothing can open it. Then ask yourself, can this being open their own lock? If they can't, they're not all-powerful. If they can, then the lock wasn't truly unopenable. This simple question cascades into an avalanche of implications about power, limitation, and the very nature of possibility. But that's just the surface. As we venture deeper, you'll encounter paradoxes that challenge everything from free will to identity. The quantum observer's dilemma suggests that by simply thinking about certain possibilities, you might be altering the very fabric of reality. It's a thought that borders on mystical, yet it's grounded in the strange truth of quantum mechanics. Consider the echo maze of consciousness. If your mind is just the product of physical processes in your brain, how can it understand itself completely? Any understanding would need to be more complex than the thing being understood. It's like trying to store a box inside itself, a logical impossibility that somehow describes our very existence. These paradoxes aren't mere intellectual curiosities. They're windows into the deepest mysteries of existence, portals that open when we push our understanding to its absolute limits. Some philosophers argue that paradoxes are nature's way of showing us the boundaries of human thought. Others suggest they're clues to a deeper reality we're only beginning to grasp. As we explore these mind-bending scenarios together, you'll find yourself questioning assumptions you never knew you had. Each paradox is like a key that unlocks new ways of thinking, yet potentially leads to doors that cannot be closed. Some might keep you awake at night, wondering about the nature of infinity, time, or your own existence. Others might provide strange comfort in their demonstration that even impossibility has its patterns. What makes these paradoxes truly fascinating isn't just their ability to challenge our thinking. It's their power to reveal the hidden architecture of reality itself. Like cosmic mirrors, they reflect the limitations and extraordinary capabilities of human consciousness. They show us where our logic breaks down, and perhaps more importantly, hint at what might lie beyond the boundaries of conventional thought. So prepare yourself for a journey through the labyrinth of paradox, where each answer leads to deeper questions, and certainty itself becomes uncertain. Whether you're hearing these to fall asleep or to expand your mind, you're about to encounter some of the most profound and perplexing ideas ever conceived by human consciousness. Remember, a true paradox isn't just a puzzle to be solved. It's a gateway to understanding the limits of understanding itself. And in a universe as strange as ours, sometimes the most impossible things turn out to be the most real. Are you ready to begin? To step into a world where logic meets its own reflection and reality isn't quite what it seems? Let's start our journey through the looking glass of reason itself. Picture yourself in a vast library of impossible things. The shelves stretch endlessly in all directions, each book containing paradoxes that shouldn't exist. The air feels charged with potential, as if the very atoms around you are both here and not here, existing in a state of perpetual contradiction. This is where our journey truly begins. In this space between certainty and doubt, we'll encounter the first of our mind-bending paradoxes, the library of Babel's Echo. Imagine a library that contains every possible book that could ever be written. Not just the books that have been written, but every book that could be. Every combination of letters, every possible story, every truth, and every lie. Within this infinite collection, somewhere, there exists a book that perfectly describes your life, including the very moment you're experiencing now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's where reality starts to unravel. This book would also describe you reading about this paradox and your reaction to learning about the book that describes you reading about the paradox. It would contain your future thoughts about this very concept, thoughts you haven't even had yet. The book exists before you think these thoughts, yet it accurately describes thoughts that haven't occurred. How can information about your future thoughts exist before you think them? The implications spiral deeper. Within this library, there would also be a book describing how the library is a complete fiction. Another book would prove, with perfect logical accuracy, that the library must exist. Both books would be equally valid within their own frameworks of logic. Which one is true? Can both be true simultaneously? As you walk through these metaphysical stacks, consider the shelves themselves. Each book references other books, which reference other books, creating an infinite web of interconnected information. The catalog system that would be needed to organize this library would itself need to be larger than the library. Yet it would also need to be contained within the library, since the library contains everything that could be written, including its own catalog. This paradox mirrors the fundamental nature of consciousness and knowledge itself. Your mind trying to comprehend these concepts is like a book attempting to read itself. Each thought about the paradox becomes part of the paradox, creating new layers of complexity that must also be contained within the original framework. The air grows thicker with possibility as we venture deeper into these philosophical stacks. Consider how this relates to the nature of truth itself. In this infinite library, every true statement would have its contradiction somewhere on another shelf. Every possible explanation for why something is true would exist alongside every possible explanation for why it's false. The very concept of absolute truth begins to dissolve in this ocean of infinite possibilities. Yet somehow, as you stand here in this impossible space, something feels strangely familiar. Perhaps it's because our own universe operates in similarly paradoxical ways. The internet, with its vast collection of information, mirrors aspects of this infinite library. Our own minds, with their capacity for endless imagination, contain smaller versions of this paradox. The ability to think about thinking, to know about knowing. The shadows between the shelves seem to shift and dance, as if they're both empty space and solid matter simultaneously. This duality reflects the quantum nature of our reality, where particles can exist in multiple states until observed. The library itself seems to breathe with this same quantum uncertainty, each book both existing and not existing until you reach for it. As we prepare to delve deeper into our exploration of paradoxes, let this impossible library serve as our framework for understanding. Like the books on these endless shelves, each paradox we'll encounter contains worlds within worlds of implications, each answer leading to new questions, each solution spawning new mysteries. The light filtering through this infinite space takes on a quality that shouldn't exist, both illuminating and obscuring, revealing and concealing simultaneously. It reminds us that in the world of paradoxes, sometimes the clearest way to see truth is to embrace the impossibility of seeing it completely. Are you ready to pull the first volume from these mysterious shelves, to begin unraveling the threads of logic that both bind and unbind our understanding of reality? The deeper we go, the stranger it gets. But like the library itself, every paradox contains a hidden truth waiting to be discovered. Let's begin with what seems like a simple question, one that emerges from the depths of our infinite library like a whisper. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? This ancient paradox, known as the Paradox of Infinite Resistance, opens a door to understanding the nature of absolutes and the limits of our logical thinking. Imagine two cosmic entities locked in an eternal dance. The first is a force so pure, so complete in its forward momentum that nothing in the universe can resist its advance. It's not just powerful, it's the very embodiment of unstoppable movement, a force that by definition cannot be halted or slowed. Now picture its opposite, an object so fundamentally stable, so perfectly fixed in space, that no force in existence could cause it to shift even a subatomic particle's width. It's not merely heavy or sturdy, it's the pure concept of immovability made real. Preparing and narrating this theory took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the theory. Now bring these two absolutes together. What happens at the moment of impact? If the force is truly unstoppable, it must continue its path forward. But if the object is truly immovable, it must remain perfectly still. Both statements cannot be simultaneously true, yet both must be true by definition. It's like trying to imagine a circle with corners or a dry form of water. The very concept creates a tear in the fabric of logic itself. But this paradox goes deeper than mere physical impossibility. It challenges our very understanding of what it means for something to be absolute. Can true absolutes exist in a universe where everything is relative? Einstein showed us that even time and space bend and flex depending on perspective. Perhaps the paradox isn't in the collision itself, but in our assumption that such perfect absolutes could exist at all. Consider how this applies to the fundamental forces of our universe. Gravity, the weakest yet most pervasive force we know, bends space itself. Light, which moves at the fastest possible speed in our universe, can still be trapped by a black hole's event horizon. Even the strongest nuclear forces have their limits. Nature seems to abhor absolutes, preferring instead a delicate dance of relativity and quantum uncertainty. Yet, our minds crave absolutes. We seek permanent truths, unbreakable rules, immutable laws of nature. This paradox might be showing us something profound about the gap between how we think reality should work and how it actually does. Like a Zen koan, its value lies not in finding a solution, but in contemplating why no solution can exist. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we apply it to human experience. How often do we encounter situations that feel like unstoppable forces meeting immovable objects, personal convictions clashing with unchangeable circumstances, dreams colliding with limitations, the eternal struggle between what must be and what cannot be. As we sit with this impossibility, something strange begins to happen. The paradox starts to feel less like a logical puzzle and more like a mirror reflecting the nature of existence itself. Perhaps the universe isn't built on absolutes at all, but on the endless interplay of opposing forces, each yielding just enough to allow reality to continue flowing forward. Think about consciousness itself, that mysterious force that allows you to contemplate these very concepts. Is it an unstoppable force of will meeting the immovable object of physical reality? Or is it something else entirely? A process that transcends simple either-or dynamics. Your very ability to ponder this paradox might be evidence of a deeper truth, that reality is more fluid, more nuanced than our binary logic can fully grasp. The beauty of this paradox lies in its perfect symmetry. Both the force and the object are equally absolute, equally impossible, and equally necessary for the paradox to exist. Like the Ouroboros, the ancient symbol of a snake eating its own tail, it creates a perfect circle of impossibility that somehow feels more true than many obvious facts. As we prepare to move deeper into our exploration of paradoxes, let this first one serve as a foundation. Remember, sometimes the most important truths lie not in finding an answer, but in understanding why certain questions cannot be answered. The collision of unstoppable force and immovable object creates a philosophical explosion that illuminates the boundaries of human thought itself. What other impossibilities await us in this journey through the landscapes of paradox? What other mirrors will we find, reflecting back the limitations and extraordinary capabilities of human consciousness? The path ahead winds through ever stranger territory, where each step both clarifies and complicates our understanding of reality itself. Now let's venture into something more personal, a paradox that strikes at the very heart of who you are, the consciousness duplicator's dilemma. Imagine a machine that could scan every atom in your body, every neural connection in your brain, every quantum state of your being, and create a perfect copy, not just a physical duplicate, but an exact replica of your consciousness at the moment of copying. The machine works flawlessly. You step in, there's a flash of light, and now there are two versions of you. Both have identical memories up to the moment of duplication. Both feel like the original you. Both have the same thoughts, same emotions, same sense of being the real you. But here's where reality starts to fragment. Which one is actually you? Now let's add another layer. Imagine the machine malfunctions during the copying process. The original body is destroyed, but the copy is created perfectly. Is this death, or is it a form of transportation? From the perspective of the copy, there would be no sense of discontinuity, just stepping into the machine and stepping out again. But something profound has happened. Every atom of the original you has been destroyed and recreated. This isn't just a thought experiment about technology. It's a window into the nature of identity itself. What makes you you? Is it the continuous chain of consciousness from moment to moment? But even in normal sleep, consciousness is interrupted. Is it the physical continuity of your body? But your cells are constantly being replaced. Is it your memories? But memories can be false, altered, or lost. The implications spiral outward like ripples in a pond. Every morning when you wake up, are you the same person who went to sleep? What about after general anesthesia, when consciousness is completely interrupted? Are you literally a different person from moment to moment, each version of you dying and being replaced by a new version with the memories of the old? This paradox touches something fundamental about existence itself. In quantum mechanics, particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed. Could consciousness work the same way? Are you, in some sense, all possible versions of yourself until something forces a single reality to crystallize? The stakes become even higher when we consider the future. If consciousness can be copied, what does that mean for death? For identity? For the very concept of an individual self? Would a copy of you, with all your memories and personality, be a form of immortality? Or would it be something else entirely? A new being who just happens to think they're you? As we sit with these questions, the boundaries between self and other, between continuity and change, begin to blur. Like waves on an ocean, individual identities might be more pattern than substance, more process than fixed reality. Your sense of being a continuous singular self might be both the most real thing you know and, paradoxically, an illusion. What does it mean to be you? As we move deeper into our exploration of paradoxes, keep this question close. Like a koan that breaks the mind to free it, sometimes the most profound truths lie not in finding answers, but in learning to dance with the questions themselves. Let's delve into what might be the most unsettling paradox yet: the observer's last dream. Imagine you're in a peculiar experiment where you've agreed to be put into a dream state. But this isn't any ordinary dream. It's a perfectly crafted simulation of your normal life, indistinguishable from reality in every way. The twist? You won't know when the experiment begins. One morning, you'll simply wake up as usual, but that waking will actually be into the dream. The simulation will be so perfect that nothing, not pinching yourself, not checking clocks, not even your most rigorous reality tests, will reveal that you're dreaming. Everything will feel, taste, smell, and behave exactly as it does in real life. Even your thoughts about whether you're dreaming will feel exactly like your normal contemplations. Now here's where the paradox tightens its grip. How do you know you haven't already entered the dream? Perhaps the experiment began yesterday, or last week, or even years ago. Perhaps this very moment, as you consider this paradox, is part of the simulation. The more you think about it, the more you realize there would be no way to tell. But it gets deeper. Since you know about the experiment, you might think you could rely on that knowledge to determine whether you're in the dream. After all, if you remember agreeing to the experiment, surely you haven't entered the dream yet, right? But the simulation would include those memories too, perfectly preserved and indistinguishable from real memories. Consider the implications. If there's absolutely no way to tell whether you're in the dream or not, what does that mean for your current experience of reality? Every moment becomes simultaneously both potentially real and potentially simulated. It's like Schrodinger's reality. You exist in a superposition of both states until what? Unlike the cat in the box, there's no future moment of revelation, no opening of the box to collapse the wave function of your reality. This paradox forces us to confront something profound about consciousness and reality. If a perfect simulation is indistinguishable from reality, then what makes reality real? Is there some fundamental quality of existence that can't be simulated? Or is our experience of reality itself just a kind of simulation our brains create to make sense of raw sensory data? The rabbit hole goes even deeper. If you can't tell whether you're in the dream, then in a very real sense, it doesn't matter whether you are or not. Your experiences, thoughts, feelings, and actions would be equally meaningful or meaningless in either state. The distinction between real and simulated begins to dissolve. Think about your memories right now. Every memory you have of your past, every experience that shaped who you are, could be part of the simulation. Or perhaps only some of them are, or none. The paradox creates a kind of eternal present, where the past becomes uncertain and the future becomes a branching tree of potential wake-ups that never arrive. This isn't just about dreams or simulations. It's about the nature of certainty itself. How do we know what we know? If we can't trust our most basic experiences and memories to tell us whether we're in base reality or not, what can we trust? Like a cognitive version of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, the very act of questioning your reality becomes part of the reality you're questioning. Some philosophers argue that we're already living in something like this paradox. Our brains, they suggest, create a simulation of reality based on limited sensory input. We never experience raw reality, only our brain's best guess at what's out there. In this view, the dream experiment merely adds another layer to a process that's already happening. The beauty of this paradox lies in its perfect circularity. Every attempt to resolve it becomes part of its structure. Every tool you might use to detect the simulation would itself be potentially simulated. Even this very paradox, and your thoughts about it, could be part of the dream's design. As we sit with this uncertainty, something strange happens. The question, am I dreaming, transforms into something more fundamental. What is reality? And perhaps that's the real value of this paradox, not in finding an answer, but in recognizing that our most basic assumptions about existence might be built on foundations as intangible as dreams. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of self-aware thoughts. Right now, as you're listening to these words, try to observe your own mind in action. Not just the thoughts themselves, but the process of thinking. You'll notice something strange start to happen, a kind of infinite regression that spirals into the depths of consciousness itself. Think about thinking about your thoughts. Now be aware that you're thinking about your thoughts. Then notice that you're aware of being aware of thinking about your thoughts. With each layer of awareness, you create a new level of thought that must itself be observed, leading to another level of awareness, and another, and another. This isn't just a word game or a tongue twister for the mind. It's a fundamental paradox of consciousness that emerges whenever we try to fully grasp our own awareness. Like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror, or like a camera trying to photograph itself, there's always something that seems to slip away. Always another level of observation that needs to be accounted for. Consider what happens when you try to catch your mind in the act of thinking. The moment you observe a thought, you create a new thought about observing the first thought. But then, you become aware of the second thought, creating a third thought, and so on. It's like trying to chase your own shadow. The faster you run, the faster it moves away from you. But here's where it gets even stranger. Who or what is doing all this observing? Is there some final, ultimate observer that watches all other thoughts? Or is it observers all the way down, each watching the other in an endless chain of awareness? The more you try to locate the fundamental you that's doing the thinking, the more it seems to dissolve into this cascade of recursive observation. This paradox has practical implications too. Think about trying to meditate or clear your mind. The very act of checking whether your mind is clear creates a thought that makes it not clear. It's like trying to check if you're asleep. The very act of checking prevents the state you're trying to verify. Now, as you're pondering this, notice how your mind tries to create metaphors and analogies to understand itself. It's like a mirror reflecting a mirror, creating an infinite tunnel of images, or like a snake trying to swallow its own tail, forever pursuing something that moves away precisely because it's moving toward it. But even these metaphors are thoughts being observed by the mind, trying to understand itself, using itself. As you explore this paradox, you might notice another strange effect. The more carefully you try to observe your own thought process, the more it seems to change under observation. Like the quantum particles that behave differently when measured, consciousness itself seems to shift and transform when subjected to its own awareness. This leads us to an even more peculiar question. Are you thinking these thoughts, or are these thoughts thinking themselves through you? When you observe your mind, what exactly is doing the observing? Is there a difference between the observer and the observed? Or are they somehow the same thing caught in an eternal dance of self-reference? Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this paradox is that you're experiencing it right now. As you think about experiencing it, each word you process creates new layers of awareness, new levels of observation, new depths of recursive thought. It's a living paradox that grows and evolves with each moment of consideration. And yet, despite this seemingly infinite regression, you continue to function. Your consciousness doesn't get lost in these endless loops. Somehow, your mind manages to navigate these recursive waters without drowning in them. This might be the biggest mystery of all, how we can be aware enough to notice this paradox without becoming paralyzed by it. Consider what we might call the infinity mirror paradox. Imagine two perfect mirrors facing each other in an endless void. Each mirror reflects the other, creating a tunnel of infinite reflections. But here's the question that will start to unravel your mind. What do these mirrors show when there's nothing but each other to reflect? Each mirror must show the other mirror, which shows the first mirror, which shows the second mirror, and so on into infinity. But if there's nothing else in this void, what's actually being reflected? It's as if reality itself gets caught in an endless loop of reference and cross-reference, creating something from nothing through pure recursion. Now imagine you could somehow step into this space between the mirrors. You'd see yourself reflected infinitely in both directions. But which reflection would be the real you? The one closest to you? That's just light bouncing once. the 100th reflection, the 1,000th. Each reflection is equally real and equally illusory, existing in a state of perpetual reference to all the others. This paradox extends far beyond simple optics. It touches something fundamental about the nature of information and reality itself. Think about how meaning is created in language. Each word is defined by other words, which are defined by still other words, creating an infinite dictionary where everything is described in terms of everything else. Yet somehow, from this circular system of reference, concrete meaning emerges. Let's go deeper. Consider your own thoughts about this paradox right now. Your understanding is built from concepts, which are built from other concepts, which are built from experiences and memories, which are themselves built from concepts. It's mirrors all the way down, each level of understanding, reflecting and being reflected by every other level. The paradox becomes even more fascinating when we apply it to consciousness itself. Your awareness of being aware creates a kind of mental infinity mirror. You can be aware of being aware of being aware, each level of metacognition reflecting back on itself in an endless cascade of self-reference. Yet from this seemingly infinite regression, a stable sense of self somehow emerges. Think about any system of knowledge or understanding. Science explains phenomena through theories, which are built on other theories, which ultimately rest on observations. But those observations are interpreted through theories. Philosophy examines ideas through frameworks built from other ideas. Mathematics proves theorems using other theorems. Each field is like a hall of mirrors, creating meaning through endless self-reference. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. In our mirror scenario, where does the light come from to create the reflections? If there's truly nothing but the mirrors in the void, there should be no light to reflect. Yet if the mirrors are perfect, they must reflect something. It's as if the very act of reflection creates what is being reflected, a kind of bootstrap paradox where effect becomes cause. This parallels a deep question in physics and philosophy. Does the universe observe itself into existence? Quantum mechanics suggests that observation affects reality at its most fundamental level. But who or what was the first observer? How did consciousness emerge from unconscious matter, only to turn around and observe that matter into definite states? The infinity mirror paradox also reveals something profound about human understanding. We can never step outside our own perspective to see reality as it really is. Every observation, every thought, every theory is caught in this web of infinite reflection, each understanding colored by the very tools we use to understand. Yet somehow, like the clear image that emerges from between two mirrors, despite the infinite regression behind it, meaning and understanding do emerge from these circular systems. Mathematics works, language communicates, consciousness persists. It's as if infinity, properly harnessed, can create finitude. Perhaps most remarkably, this paradox suggests that emptiness and fullness might be two sides of the same coin. The void between the mirrors is simultaneously empty, containing nothing but reflections, and infinitely full, containing endless reflections of reflections. Like the quantum vacuum, which is both utterly empty and seething with potential energy, the space between perfect mirrors becomes a metaphor for the nature of reality itself. As you contemplate this paradox, notice how your mind tries to resolve it. Each attempt at resolution becomes part of the infinite reflection. Each understanding reflects back on itself. Each thought creates new depths to explore. It's a living demonstration of the very principle it describes. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect memory. Imagine your mind was suddenly blessed, or perhaps cursed, with perfect, absolute recall. Every moment, every sensation, every thought and feeling preserved in crystalline clarity, forever accessible as if it just happened. At first, this might seem like a gift, but as we unravel its implications, something profoundly disturbing begins to emerge. Consider what it would mean to remember everything perfectly. Not just the broad strokes of your life, but every single detail. The exact pattern of sunlight on your breakfast table this morning. The precise rhythm of your heartbeat as you read these words. The complete sensory experience of every moment you've ever lived, stored with perfect fidelity. But here's where the paradox begins to bite. If you remember everything perfectly, how do you make sense of anything? Memory isn't just about storage, it's about meaning. Your brain typically forms memories by focusing on what's important and letting the rest fade. It creates patterns, makes connections, builds understanding by selectively forgetting the irrelevant and reinforcing the significant. With perfect memory, this process breaks down. Imagine trying to remember someone's face when you remember every single expression they've ever made with equal clarity. Which version is really them? The smile from last Tuesday, the concerned look from 3 years ago, the laugh from this morning. Without the natural fading and blending of memories, identity itself becomes fragmented into countless perfect moments, none more real than any other. The paradox deepens when we consider the relationship between memory and time. Your brain typically compresses time, creating a flowing narrative from discrete moments. But with perfect recall, every instant would be equally present, equally immediate. Yesterday wouldn't feel more distant than 10 years ago. Both would be perfectly preserved, perfectly accessible. Think about how this would affect your sense of self. Your identity is built partly on the natural erosion of memory, the way some experiences fade while others stay sharp, creating the contours of who you are. But if everything stays equally vivid, how do you change? How do you grow? How do you learn from mistakes when every triumph and failure remains eternally present, eternally fresh? The emotional implications are even more staggering. Every joy would remain perfectly preserved, but so would every sorrow, every embarrassment, every moment of pain or regret. You couldn't even take comfort in knowing that time heals all wounds, because time would lose its healing power. Each wound would remain forever fresh, forever new. Now consider how this perfect memory would affect your relationships. Every argument, every misunderstanding, every thoughtless word would remain perfectly preserved alongside every moment of love and connection. How do you forgive when you can't forget? How do you move forward when the past is always perfectly present? The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider the nature of consciousness itself. Your mind typically processes reality by filtering, selecting, forgetting. But with perfect memory, every moment would demand equal attention, equal processing power. Would there be any room for new experiences when every past experience remains perfectly vivid? Even the concept of now becomes problematic. With normal memory, the present moment feels special, distinct from our hazier memories of the past. But if every moment is remembered with perfect clarity, what makes the present unique? Is it just another perfect memory in the making, indistinguishable from the countless others? This leads us to an even stranger question. In a mind with perfect memory, could there be any meaningful difference between remembering and experiencing? If your memory of a sunset from 10 years ago is just as vivid, just as detailed, just as emotionally present as watching a sunset right now, what separates memory from reality? Perhaps most unsettling is how this paradox reflects something fundamental about consciousness and identity. Our imperfect memories, our ability to forget, to simplify, to let things fade. These aren't bugs in the system. They're features that make consciousness possible, that allow us to form coherent identities and navigate reality. As you consider this paradox, notice how your own memories shift and flow. The very fact that you can forget, that your memories can fade and change, might be what allows you to remember anything meaningful at all. It's a strange truth. Perfect memory would make true memory impossible. Let's delve into what we might call the paradox of preventive knowledge. Imagine receiving a mysterious envelope containing detailed predictions about catastrophic events that will occur in your future. The predictions are so specific, so accurate about things that have already happened, that you're convinced they're genuine. Among these predictions is a terrible personal tragedy that will occur exactly 1 week from now. The paradox emerges in your response to this knowledge. If you believe the predictions and successfully take actions to prevent the tragedy, then the prediction was false. But if the prediction was false, you would have had no reason to take preventive action, which means the tragedy would have occurred, making the prediction true again. Each possibility seems to negate itself, creating a loop of impossibility. This isn't just a simple logical puzzle. It strikes at the heart of causality and free will. Consider the moment you decide to act on the prediction. Your action is caused by knowledge from the future, but that future only exists in a timeline where you didn't have that knowledge. It's as if reality itself gets caught in a knot, with cause and effect chasing each other in an endless circle. The paradox becomes even more intricate when we consider the nature of the knowledge itself. If the prediction is truly accurate, it must account for your reaction to receiving it. But how can it account for your reaction to information contained within itself? It's like a book that describes your response to reading it before you've read it. The very act of reading changes what should be written. Now imagine extending this to all the predictions in the envelope. Each one you prevent creates its own paradox, each prevention potentially affecting the others. The web of causality becomes so tangled that it's impossible to trace any clear line between cause and effect. It's as if time itself becomes recursive, with future knowledge creating past actions that prevent the future that created the knowledge. But here's where it gets even stranger. What about the psychological impact of this knowledge? Even if you prevent the predicted tragedy, you now live with the awareness that in some version of reality, it would have happened. This awareness itself becomes a kind of tragedy, different from the predicted one, but perhaps equally impactful. The very act of prevention creates new consequences that couldn't have been predicted. Consider the ethical implications. If you receive such knowledge, do you have an obligation to act on it? But if acting on it makes the knowledge false, were you ever really obligated? It's like being responsible for preventing something that, because of your prevention, never would have happened. The moral weight exists in a superposition of being both real and unreal. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider multiple observers. If you share the predictions with others, their actions too become part of the causal loop. Each person's response to the knowledge creates new branches of possibility, new potential futures that somehow must have been accounted for in the original predictions. It's as if reality becomes a hall of mirrors, each reflection showing a different version of what might or might not happen. This leads us to questions about the nature of time itself. Is the future fixed, making the predictions possible, but prevention impossible? Or is it fluid, making prevention possible, but the predictions impossible? Or is there some third option, where time is neither fixed nor fluid, but something more complex? A quantum superposition of all possible futures collapsed by our observations and actions. Perhaps most unsettling is how this paradox reflects our everyday experience of knowledge and action. Every time we make a decision based on predicted consequences, we're engaging in a milder version of this paradox. Our knowledge of potential futures influences our present actions, which change those futures which should have changed our knowledge. Yet somehow, reality continues. The paradox of preventive knowledge also touches something deep about human consciousness and our relationship with time. We constantly live in this tension between known and unknown futures, between prevention and acceptance, between fate and free will. Every decision we make is both caused by and causes our understanding of what might happen. As you contemplate this paradox, notice how your mind tries to resolve it. Each potential solution creates new problems. Each answer raises new questions. It's as if the paradox itself is a prediction of your attempts to understand it. Your understanding changing what there is to understand. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of anticipated experience. Imagine you're planning the perfect vacation, a trip you've dreamed about for years. You research every detail, read every review, plan every moment. In your mind, you construct such a complete and vivid picture of how everything will unfold that something strange begins to happen. The anticipation becomes more real than the experience itself could ever be. Here's where the paradox emerges. The more perfectly you imagine and plan an experience, the more you ensure it can never live up to your expectations. Your imagination, unbounded by reality's constraints, creates a version of the experience that reality, bound by physical limitations, can never match. Yet, without this imagination and planning, you couldn't create meaningful experiences at all. Think about how this plays out in everyday life. When you eagerly await something, a meal at a famous restaurant, a meeting with an admired person, a long-anticipated event, your mind constructs an idealized version of what will happen. This mental construction becomes so detailed, so emotionally resonant, that it creates a kind of experience before the experience, a shadow reality that competes with actual reality. But here's the deeper twist. Your anticipation doesn't just predict the experience, it actively changes it. The expectations you form become part of the experience itself. If you expect perfection, every tiny flaw becomes magnified. If you expect disaster, every small success feels like a triumph. The anticipated experience creates a lens through which the actual experience must be viewed. Consider how this affects memory as well. After an experience, which version do you actually remember? The anticipation that came before? The reality that occurred? Or some complex blend of both, mixed with your reactions to how they differed? Your memory becomes a palimpsest, each layer affecting how you see the others, creating a recursive loop of expectation, experience, and recollection. The paradox deepens when we consider how this affects our ability to plan for the future. If our anticipations inevitably distort our experiences, how can we ever make truly informed decisions about what experiences to seek? It's as if we're constantly navigating using a map that changes the territory it's meant to represent. This leads us to an even stranger consideration. What role does consciousness play in this paradox? Your conscious mind creates these anticipations, yet consciousness itself exists in a kind of eternal present. You can imagine the future and remember the past, but you can only experience the now. So when you anticipate an experience, you're creating a present moment experience of something that hasn't happened yet, which will affect your present moment experience when it does happen. The implications spiral outward. Think about how this affects relationships. When you meet someone new, your mind immediately begins constructing a model of who they are, how they think, what they might do. This model affects how you interact with them, which affects how they respond, which changes your model. An endless dance of expectation and reality, each shaping the other. Perhaps most fascinating is how this paradox intersects with the nature of desire itself. We often want things precisely because we can imagine them being perfect. But this very imagination ensures they can never be perfect when we get them. Yet without this capacity for imagination and anticipation, would we want anything at all? The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider collective anticipation. Think about how society builds shared expectations about the future, technological progress, social change, global events. These collective anticipations shape how we act in the present, which shapes what actually happens, which never quite matches what we anticipated. It's like trying to catch your own shadow. The faster you run toward it, the faster it moves away. The more precisely you try to pin down how an experience will be, the more you ensure it will be something else entirely. Yet this very impossibility of perfect prediction might be what makes experience meaningful. As you sit with this paradox, notice how it affects your own anticipations of what's to come. Even your expectations about understanding this paradox create a lens through which you understand it. It's an endless recursion of anticipation and experience, each feeding into and transforming the other. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of shifting perspectives. Imagine you're standing in a room with 4 perfect mirrors, each facing a different direction. In the center of the room is an object that appears completely different in each mirror. Not just slightly different, fundamentally, irreconcilably different. In one mirror, it's a perfect sphere. In another, a perfect cube. In the third, a perfect pyramid. And in the fourth, a perfect cylinder. The paradox isn't just that the object appears different in each mirror. It's that each reflection is equally true, equally accurate, and equally complete. There's no distortion, no trick of light, no optical illusion. The object somehow exists simultaneously as all these shapes, each perspective being both perfectly correct and completely incompatible with the others. Think about what this means for the nature of reality itself. If something can be simultaneously a sphere and a cube, a pyramid and a cylinder, what does that tell us about the fundamental nature of objects? About the relationship between perception and reality? About truth itself? The paradox deepens when we consider your position as the observer. As you move around the room, each perspective becomes your reality in turn. When you're looking at the sphere reflection, that feels like the true nature of the object. When you move to see the cube, that becomes the truth. Each view feels complete and correct while you're experiencing it, yet you know the other views exist simultaneously. But here's where it gets even stranger. What happens when you try to synthesize these perspectives? Your mind wants to create a unified understanding, to reconcile these conflicting views into a single, coherent truth. But any attempt to combine them creates something that's neither sphere nor cube, nor pyramid, nor cylinder, something that couldn't possibly cast any of these reflections. Consider how this paradox mirrors our experience of consciousness itself. Your perspective in any given moment feels complete, definitive, true. Yet you know that your perspective constantly shifts, with time, with mood, with new information. Each view feels absolute while you hold it, yet you know it's just one of many possible views. The implications extend far beyond simple perception. Think about how this applies to understanding other people. Each person you meet is simultaneously many things: a professional self, a family self, a private self, a public self. Each version is equally real, equally true, yet sometimes completely contradictory. Like the object in the mirrors, people exist as multiple, incompatible truths simultaneously. Now consider how this affects our understanding of truth itself. If something can be simultaneously multiple, incompatible things, what does that mean for our pursuit of knowledge, for our belief in absolute truth, for our confidence in our own perceptions? The paradox becomes even more complex when we consider shared perspectives. If two people look at the same mirror together, they see the same reflection. But how can they ever truly know they're seeing the same thing? Each observer brings their own context, their own understanding, their own reality to what they see. This leads us to questions about the nature of observation itself. In quantum physics, the act of observation affects what is being observed. In our mirror room, the act of choosing which mirror to look at determines what truth becomes real for you in that moment. It's as if reality itself is fluid, shaped by the very act of trying to understand it. Perhaps most unsettling is how this paradox challenges our fundamental assumptions about reality. We tend to believe that things must be one way or another, that contradictions cannot coexist. But what if the deepest truth is that everything is simultaneously many incompatible things, and our perception of singular reality is the real illusion? As you contemplate this paradox, notice how your mind tries to resolve it. Each attempt at resolution becomes another perspective, another reflection in another mirror. It's as if the very act of trying to understand creates new facets of what needs to be understood, new angles from which truth can be viewed. The paradox of shifting perspectives suggests something profound. Perhaps truth isn't something we discover, but something we create through the act of observation. Each perspective is both absolutely true and fundamentally incomplete. The only way to approach full understanding might be to embrace the impossibility of reconciling all possible views. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of recursive memory. Imagine your consciousness suddenly splits into two identical streams, the you of right now and another you that exists 5 minutes in the future. Both versions are connected by perfect awareness. Each knows exactly what the other is thinking and experiencing in real time. Now here's where reality starts to unravel. The future you remembers everything the present you is thinking and doing, while the present you knows everything the future you will think and do. But this creates an impossible loop of causation. Your current thoughts are shaped by knowing what you'll think in 5 minutes, but your thoughts in 5 minutes are determined by what you're thinking now. Consider how this would affect decision-making. If you decide to raise your right hand, is it because you saw your future self do it? Or did your future self do it because you decided to? Each action becomes both cause and effect of itself, creating a closed loop of causation that has no clear beginning or end. The paradox deepens when we consider the nature of free will in this scenario. Are either version of you truly making choices? The present you acts based on knowledge of future actions, while the future you is bound by the memories of past decisions. It's as if free will gets caught in an infinite reflection between two temporal mirrors, each decision simultaneously determined and determining. But here's where it gets even stranger. What happens to the experience of time itself? The future you experiences everything 5 minutes ahead, but also remembers the present you's current experience. Meanwhile, the present you knows what will happen 5 minutes ahead while living in the now. Time becomes both linear and circular, flowing forward while folding back on itself. Think about how this would affect your experience of consciousness. Would you feel like one mind split across time or two minds perfectly synchronized? Would there be any meaningful difference between memory and prediction when both are equally perfect and immediate? The boundary between past, present, and future becomes blurred to the point of meaninglessness. The implications spiral outward when we consider emotion and experience. If you feel joy right now, is it because you know you'll be joyful in 5 minutes? Or will you be joyful in 5 minutes because you're joyful now? Each emotional state becomes both cause and effect of itself, creating a strange loop of psychological causation. Now consider how this paradox reflects something fundamental about consciousness itself. Even in normal experience, our present moment is constantly shaped by our memories of the past and our anticipations of the future. We exist in a kind of temporal spread, never purely in the now. The recursive memory paradox just makes this explicit and perfect. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider learning and knowledge. If future you knows something, present you instantly knows it too. But where did the knowledge originally come from? It's as if information exists in a closed loop, with no point of original discovery. Knowledge becomes self-causing, emerging from the very loop that it creates. Perhaps most unsettling is how this paradox challenges our basic understanding of cause and effect. We typically think of causation as a linear chain of events, each leading to the next. But in this scenario, causation becomes circular, with each event simultaneously causing and being caused by every other event in the loop. This leads us to deeper questions about the nature of time itself. Is time truly linear, or is our experience of linear time just a limitation of normal consciousness? Could all moments exist simultaneously, with our perception of flow being the real illusion? The recursive memory paradox suggests that linear time might be more flexible than we imagine. The paradox also touches something profound about identity and continuity of self. If two versions of you exist across time, perfectly aware of each other, are they truly separate? Or does the perfect connection make them one consciousness experiencing two moments simultaneously? The very concept of individual moments of experience begins to break down. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect uncertainty. Imagine you're given a box containing a piece of information so profound, so complete, that it explains everything in the universe. Every mystery of physics, every question of philosophy, every secret of existence, all answered perfectly within this single box. But here's the twist. The moment you understand the information, it becomes false. This isn't a simple case of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle or the observer effect. It's deeper. The very act of comprehending the information fundamentally changes the nature of reality itself. Understanding the truth makes it untrue, creating a new truth that you don't understand, which when understood becomes false again. Think about what this means for the nature of knowledge itself. The perfect explanation exists, but it can never be perfectly understood. The moment you grasp it, it slips away, transformed into something else. It's like trying to catch your own reflection in a mirror that moves every time you look at it. The paradox deepens when we consider what it means to understand something. Is partial understanding possible? If you comprehend 50% of the information, does reality change by 50%? Or is understanding binary? Either you get it or you don't. Each possibility creates its own cascade of paradoxical implications. Now consider how this affects the pursuit of knowledge. Scientists, philosophers, and seekers of truth are all chasing something that becomes false the moment they catch it. Every discovery changes what there is to discover. Every answer transforms the question. It's like trying to complete a puzzle that rearranges itself with each piece you place. But here's where it gets even stranger. What does this mean for the nature of truth itself? If perfect knowledge is impossible because understanding changes what is true, can there be such a thing as absolute truth? Or is truth necessarily dynamic, always shifting in response to our attempts to grasp it? The implications become even more complex when we consider collective knowledge. If one person's understanding changes reality for everyone, what happens when multiple people try to understand simultaneously? Does reality flicker between different states? Does it split into multiple versions? The paradox creates a kind of quantum uncertainty at the macroscopic level of consciousness itself. Think about how this reflects our actual pursuit of knowledge. Every major scientific discovery has changed not just what we know, but what we can know. Einstein's theories didn't just add to Newton's understanding, they fundamentally changed what gravity and space-time meant. Perhaps this paradox isn't just theoretical, but a fundamental aspect of how knowledge works. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider consciousness itself. If consciousness is what transforms potential knowledge into actual understanding, and understanding changes reality, then consciousness becomes both the creator and destroyer of truth. We are simultaneously the seekers and the transformers of what we seek. Perhaps most unsettling is how this paradox affects our relationship with mystery. If perfect knowledge is impossible because understanding changes what can be known, then mystery isn't just a temporary state of ignorance. It's a fundamental and necessary aspect of reality. The unknown isn't something to be eliminated, but something that must exist for knowledge to be possible at all. This leads us to questions about the nature of wisdom. Maybe true wisdom isn't about accumulating knowledge, but about understanding the necessarily dynamic relationship between knowledge and reality. Perhaps the wisest response to the paradox of perfect uncertainty is to embrace uncertainty itself as the only constant. The paradox also challenges our assumptions about progress. If each understanding changes what there is to understand, can we ever truly advance in knowledge? Or are we more like a cosmic kaleidoscope, constantly rearranging patterns of understanding into new configurations, none more true than the others? As you contemplate this paradox, notice how it affects your own pursuit of understanding. Even trying to understand the paradox changes what there is to understand about it. It's a living example of its own principle, transforming as you grasp it, always staying just beyond the reach of complete comprehension. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of infinite pattern recognition. Imagine staring at pure static on an old television screen, watching the random dance of black and white pixels. At first, it seems like pure chaos, meaningless noise. But as you keep watching, something strange begins to happen. Your mind starts to detect patterns, faces, shapes, letters, numbers, all emerging from the random noise. Here's where the paradox emerges. Given enough time and enough random data, every possible pattern must eventually appear. In fact, every possible sequence of patterns must appear, including perfect replicas of every moment of your life, every thought you've ever had, every possible variation of every possible reality. Think about what this means. In truly random noise, you could theoretically find the complete works of Shakespeare, the solution to world peace, the deepest secrets of the universe, all encoded in meaningful patterns. But here's the twist. Since these patterns emerge from randomness, how can you tell which ones are meaningful and which are just coincidental arrangements of chaos? The paradox deepens when we consider the nature of pattern recognition itself. Your brain is hardwired to find patterns. It's how we make sense of the world. But at what point does pattern recognition become pattern creation? Are you discovering order within chaos? Or is your mind imposing order onto chaos? Consider how this applies to broader reality. When we look at the stars and see constellations, are we finding genuine patterns or creating them? When we see faces in clouds or meaning in coincidences, are we detecting signal or generating it from noise? The line between discovery and creation becomes increasingly blurred. Now imagine applying this to consciousness itself. Your stream of thoughts might seem ordered and meaningful, but could it be that you're simply imposing patterns onto the random firing of neurons? Is consciousness itself just a particularly convincing pattern we've learned to recognize in the static of brain activity? The implications become even more fascinating when we consider prediction and probability. If every possible pattern must eventually emerge from randomness, then everything that can happen will happen, including perfect predictions of future events. But since these predictions emerge alongside countless false predictions, how could you ever know which ones to trust? Think about how this affects our understanding of meaning itself. If every possible pattern exists within randomness, then every possible interpretation of every possible event must also exist. It's as if meaning becomes both infinite and meaningless simultaneously. Everything means everything, which means nothing means anything specifically. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider digital information. In an infinite string of random numbers, you could find the complete binary code for every possible computer program, every possible digital image, every possible piece of music. Yet finding these patterns would be meaningless without already knowing what you're looking for. Perhaps most unsettling is how this paradox reflects our search for meaning in life. We constantly look for patterns in events, for signs and significance in coincidences. But if every possible pattern exists in randomness, how can we tell which patterns are genuinely meaningful and which are just statistical inevitabilities? This leads us to questions about the nature of reality itself. Is the universe fundamentally ordered with occasional patches of randomness, or is it fundamentally random, with order emerging as a kind of perceptual illusion? Are we pattern-finding creatures in a random universe, or random elements somehow capable of recognizing real cosmic order? The paradox also challenges our understanding of creativity and discovery. If every possible pattern exists within randomness, is anything truly original? Or is creativity just the art of selecting and highlighting patterns that were always there, waiting to be noticed? As you consider this paradox, notice how your mind automatically begins searching for patterns in these very thoughts. Each attempt to understand creates new patterns to be understood, new arrangements of meaning emerging from the chaos of possibility. It's as if the very act of thinking about pattern recognition creates new patterns to recognize. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of infinite reduction. Imagine you're trying to explain something, anything at all, in the simplest possible terms. As you break down complex ideas into simpler ones, you discover something strange. Each simplified explanation requires its own explanation, which in turn needs to be simplified, creating an endless cascade of nested definitions. Take a simple word like red. To explain it simply, you might say it's a color. But then you need to explain what color is. To explain color, you need to explain light, wavelengths, perception, consciousness. Each definition spawns new terms that need defining. Each explanation creates new concepts that need explaining. It's like trying to empty an ocean with a spoon. The more you remove, the more you find. But here's where the paradox truly emerges. As you try to make things simpler, your total explanation becomes increasingly complex. The pursuit of ultimate simplicity leads to infinite complexity. It's as if simplicity itself is an illusion that dissolves the closer you try to grasp it. Think about how this affects our understanding of knowledge itself. We build complex ideas from simpler ones, but those simpler ideas rest on even more fundamental concepts, which themselves need explanation. It's like a tower built on increasingly detailed foundations, each level requiring more elaborate support structures than the one above it. Consider mathematics, often considered the purest form of logical explanation. Even basic arithmetic requires an understanding of number theory, which rests on set theory, which depends on logical axioms, which need their own justification. The simplest equation contains within it an infinity of underlying complexity. Now apply this to consciousness itself. Your immediate experience feels simple and direct, but try to explain exactly what you're experiencing. Each attempt at description opens new depths of complexity, new layers of perception and awareness that need to be accounted for. It's like trying to describe the exact sensation of being aware, of being aware, of being aware. The paradox deepens when we consider language. Words are meant to simplify communication, to package complex ideas into manageable units. But each word carries with it an entire history of meanings, contexts, and associations. The simpler we try to make our expression, the more meaning we must leave unexplained. Think about how this affects our pursuit of truth. We seek elegant, simple theories to explain the universe, yet each simple explanation requires an increasingly complex framework of supporting concepts. It's as if reality itself resists final simplification, always hiding another layer of complexity behind every simplified facade. Perhaps most fascinating is how this paradox mirrors the structure of physical reality. Scientists seek a theory of everything, a simple set of equations that explains all physical phenomena. Yet the simpler and more fundamental the theory becomes, the more complex and numerous its implications grow. The implications extend to understanding itself. When do we truly understand something? Each level of understanding reveals new depths that need to be understood. It's like peeling an infinite onion. There's always another layer, always more complexity, hiding behind apparent simplicity. This leads us to questions about the nature of explanation itself. Is perfect explanation possible? Or does the act of explaining necessarily create new complexities that need explaining? It's as if meaning itself is fractal, revealing endless new patterns at every scale of examination. Consider how this affects our relationship with knowledge. We often think of learning as a process of simplification, of breaking complex things down into simpler components. But what if this process is inherently impossible to complete? What if every simplification necessarily creates new complexities? The paradox also touches something profound about consciousness and comprehension. Perhaps our minds are designed to navigate between levels of complexity rather than to achieve perfect understanding. Like a camera that can focus on only one depth at a time, maybe consciousness itself can only hold one level of complexity in focus, while the others remain blurry. As you ponder this paradox, notice how each attempt to simplify your understanding creates new complexities to be understood. It's a living demonstration of the very principle it describes, an endless dance between simplicity and complexity that never quite resolves. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of quantum choice. Imagine every decision you've ever made created not just one outcome, but split reality into multiple branches, each containing a different version of you who made a different choice. Now, imagine you could somehow become aware of all these alternate selves simultaneously, experiencing every possible version of your life at once. The paradox emerges when we consider what you means in this context. Each version feels equally real, equally authentic, equally you. But they've made different choices, lived different lives, become different people. Are they all truly you? Is there a real you among them? Or is your true identity somehow the sum of all possible versions of yourself? Think about the decision you're making right now, whether to keep listening, to shift position, to let your mind wander. In countless other realities, other versions of you are making slightly different choices. Each small decision creates new branches, new possibilities, new versions of you. The number of potential yous grows exponentially with each passing moment. But here's where it gets stranger. If every possible choice creates a new reality, then somewhere there exists a version of you who made every possible decision. A you who became an astronaut. A you who chose to live in a remote mountain cabin. A you who became a world-famous musician. Each of these versions feels like the real you to themselves. Consider how this affects the concept of free will. If every possible choice is actually made by some version of you, are you really choosing anything? Or are you simply becoming aware of which branch of reality you're experiencing? It's as if choice itself becomes both infinitely meaningful and completely meaningless simultaneously. The paradox deepens when we consider consciousness. Each version of you has their own stream of consciousness, their own sense of being the real you. But if you could somehow experience all these streams simultaneously, would that be a higher form of consciousness? Or would it be a kind of madness, an overwhelming flood of conflicting experiences and memories? Think about how this affects your understanding of potential. Every skill you could have developed, every relationship you could have pursued, every path you could have taken, all of these exist as actual realities for other versions of you. The boundary between potential and actual begins to blur. Everything you could be, you already are, somewhere. Now consider how this paradox reflects the quantum nature of reality itself. Just as particles can exist in multiple states until observed, perhaps consciousness itself exists in multiple states until it collapses into specific experiences through the act of awareness. Each moment of consciousness might be a kind of quantum measurement, selecting one reality from an infinity of possibilities. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider memory and identity. Your memories help define who you are, but in this scenario, which memories are truly yours? The ones you currently have? The ones you could have had? The sum of all possible memories across all possible versions of you? Identity itself becomes fluid, extending across an infinite landscape of possibility. Perhaps most unsettling is how this paradox affects our understanding of regret and possibility. Every path not taken is actually taken by another you. Every mistake avoided is made somewhere. Every opportunity missed is seized elsewhere. Nothing is truly lost or gained. It all exists simultaneously in the vast web of quantum reality. This leads us to questions about the nature of reality itself. Is our experience of a single, definite reality just a limited perspective on an infinite array of simultaneous possibilities? Are we like flatland creatures trying to comprehend a three-dimensional object, capable of perceiving only one slice of a much larger reality? The paradox also challenges our understanding of causality. If every possible choice creates its own reality, then cause and effect become more like a web than a chain. Every effect has multiple causes, and every cause leads to multiple effects, all existing simultaneously across different branches of reality. As you contemplate this paradox, notice how your mind tries to hold multiple possibilities at once. Each thought about what could be creates new branches of possibility, new versions of reality to consider. It's as if the very act of thinking about quantum choice demonstrates the principle it describes. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect opposition. Imagine two beings of pure concept. One embodies absolute truth, the other absolute falsehood. These aren't just ideas or abstractions, they're conscious entities that exist in perfect, eternal opposition. Each is defined entirely by its opposition to the other. Here's where the paradox begins to emerge. If one being is absolute truth, then everything about it must be true, including its understanding of falsehood. But if it perfectly understands falsehood, doesn't it contain falsehood within itself? Similarly, if the being of absolute falsehood is truly absolute, then even its own nature must be false, meaning it can't truly be absolute falsehood. Think about how this creates an impossible loop. The truth being must contain some falsehood to truly understand what it opposes, while the falsehood being must contain some truth, even if only the truth of its own falseness. Each absolute requires its opposite to exist, yet cannot exist in pure form because of this very requirement. The paradox deepens when we consider consciousness itself. How can a being of pure truth be conscious without experiencing doubt? How can a being of pure falsehood have any coherent experience at all? It's as if consciousness itself requires both truth and falsehood, both certainty and uncertainty, to exist. Now consider how this applies to knowledge and understanding. To truly know something, must we also know its opposite? Does understanding truth require understanding falsehood? The paradox suggests that pure, absolute knowledge might be impossible, that all understanding contains within it seeds of its own contradiction. But here's where it gets even stranger. What happens when these beings interact? If absolute truth encounters absolute falsehood, what occurs at the point of contact? It's like trying to imagine what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, but in the realm of pure concept rather than physical force. The implications spiral outward when we consider how this affects reality itself. If pure truth and pure falsehood can't exist in isolation, what does this mean for our pursuit of truth? Perhaps all truth contains elements of falsehood, and all falsehood contains elements of truth, not as a compromise, but as a necessary condition of existence. Think about how this reflects in human consciousness. We often try to categorize thoughts, beliefs, and ideas as either true or false. But perhaps this binary thinking is itself a kind of falsehood. Maybe truth and falsehood are more like two poles of a magnet. Try to separate them, and you just create new poles, new oppositions. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider language and meaning. How can we even discuss absolute truth or falsehood when the words themselves must contain elements of both? It's as if the very act of describing these concepts introduces impurities into their absolute nature. Perhaps most unsettling is how this paradox affects our understanding of opposition itself. If perfect opponents require elements of each other to exist, is true opposition even possible? Or is all opposition actually a form of hidden connection, a way that apparent opposites define and create each other? This leads us to questions about the nature of reality itself. If absolute opposition is impossible, what does this mean for our understanding of good and evil, right and wrong, being and nothingness? Perhaps these dualities are more like different aspects of a single reality than truly separate things. The paradox also challenges our concept of identity and definition. If everything contains elements of its opposite, how can anything have a fixed, absolute identity. Maybe all definition is actually a process of constant negotiation between opposing forces rather than a static state. As you ponder this paradox, notice how your mind tries to resolve the contradiction. Each attempt at resolution creates new oppositions to be resolved, new paradoxes to be understood. It's as if the very act of thinking about perfect opposition demonstrates why it cannot exist. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of self-creation. Imagine you're given access to a time machine with one specific purpose. You can travel back to any moment in your past and give yourself advice. The machine works perfectly. Your past self will believe and act on whatever you say. But here's where reality starts to unravel. Any change you make to your past instantly changes who you are in the present. The paradox emerges when we consider the implications. If you travel back and give yourself different advice, you become a different person. Someone who might make different choices about what advice to give. But those different choices create yet another version of you who might give different advice again. It's an endless loop of self-modification, each version creating and uncreating itself. Think about how this affects the concept of identity itself. If you could perfectly shape your past self, who would you choose to become? But the moment you make that choice, you become someone else, someone who might want something entirely different for themselves. Your very desires and values shift with each potential change. The paradox deepens when we consider the nature of wisdom and experience. The lessons you've learned, the wisdom you've gained, these come from your struggles and mistakes. If you prevent those mistakes, you prevent the learning that made you wise enough to want to prevent them. It's like trying to build a foundation after you've already built the house. Now consider how this reflects the actual process of personal growth. Every time you learn something new about yourself, you become someone slightly different, someone who might have made different choices in the past. But those past choices created the you who learned the lesson. Each realization about yourself changes who you are, which changes what you can realize. The implications become even more complex when we consider consciousness and memory. If you change your past, do you remember the original timeline? Or do your memories instantly update to match the new reality? If they update, how would you even know you'd changed anything? If they don't update, how can you be sure which set of memories is real? Think about how this paradox mirrors our everyday experience of self-reflection. When you look back at your past choices, the very act of reflection changes who you are, which changes how you reflect on those choices. It's an endless feedback loop of consciousness, observing itself and being changed by the observation. Perhaps most fascinating is how this paradox affects our understanding of free will and determinism. If your future self can change your past self, who's really making the choices? Are you exercising free will, or are you caught in an infinite loop of temporal cause and effect, each version of you simultaneously creating and being created by the others? The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider identity across time. Are you the same person you were 5 years ago? Will you be the same person 5 years from now? If not, what right does your current self have to make decisions that will affect these other versions of you? It's like trying to make choices for a stranger who happens to share your name. Consider how this affects our relationship with regret and responsibility. If you could prevent your past mistakes, would you still be the person who learned from them? Would preventing the mistakes be itself a kind of mistake? The very concept of improvement becomes paradoxical. To fix your flaws, you need the wisdom that came from having them. This leads us to questions about the nature of personal growth itself. Is growth a linear process of becoming better, or is it more like a spiral where each advancement creates new challenges, new perspectives, new versions of ourselves to grapple with? Maybe the self isn't something we perfect, but something we continuously negotiate with. The paradox also challenges our understanding of intention and outcome. When you try to improve yourself, who exactly is doing the improving? And who are they trying to improve into? It's like trying to lift yourself up by pulling on your own bootstraps. The very act seems to contain its own impossibility. As you contemplate this paradox, notice how your thoughts about it change who you are, which changes how you think about it. Each moment of consideration creates a new version of you, considering it differently. It's a living demonstration of the very principle it describes. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of collective consciousness. Imagine an idea so powerful, so fundamentally transformative, that simply understanding it changes not just your own mind, but the minds of everyone who has ever existed or will exist. The moment you grasp it, this understanding ripples backward and forward through time, altering every human consciousness simultaneously. Here's where the paradox begins to bite. If this idea changes all minds throughout history, then the people who created the conditions for you to discover it would have been different people with different thoughts and actions. But if they were different, they might not have created those conditions. Yet if they didn't create those conditions, you couldn't have discovered the idea that changed them. Think about how this affects the entire chain of human knowledge and culture. Every book you've read, every conversation you've had, every piece of art or music that shaped your understanding. All of these would have been created by minds already affected by your future realization. But if they were affected by it, how could they have led you to discover it in the first place? The paradox deepens when we consider language itself. The words you use to understand and express this idea would have been shaped by minds already transformed by it. But if the language itself was different, how could you have formulated the idea? It's like trying to build a house using tools that only exist once the house is built. Now consider how this reflects the actual nature of human consciousness and culture. Every significant idea does change the past, in a way. When we learn something profound, it changes how we interpret everything that came before. But usually, this change is personal and gradual. The paradox makes this process instant and universal. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider collective memory and shared understanding. If everyone's consciousness changed simultaneously across time, would we even notice the change? Would there be any before state to compare it to? It's like trying to remember what it was like before you knew how to read. The very ability to contemplate the question requires the knowledge you're trying to imagine not having. Think about how this paradox affects the concept of innovation and discovery. If an idea changes all minds throughout history, can it truly be said to have been discovered at any particular moment? Or Does it exist in a strange temporal loop, always having been known because it would eventually be known? Perhaps most unsettling is how this relates to our understanding of consciousness itself. If consciousness can be fundamentally altered by future realizations, what does this say about its nature? Is a consciousness truly individual, or is it more like a vast network that extends across time, each mind influencing and being influenced by all others? The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider cultural evolution. How do ideas actually spread and transform societies? If a truly transformative idea emerges, does it in some sense already exist in the collective unconscious, waiting to be articulated? The boundary between discovery and creation becomes increasingly blurred. Consider how this affects our understanding of truth and knowledge. If an idea can retroactively change the conditions that led to its discovery, what does this mean for the nature of truth itself? Perhaps truth isn't something we find, but something we participate in creating, a dynamic process rather than a static reality. This leads us to questions about the relationship between individual and collective consciousness. Are our thoughts truly our own, or are they more like nodes in a vast network of shared understanding, each influencing and being influenced by the whole? Maybe consciousness itself is less individual than we imagine. The paradox also challenges our assumptions about causality and influence. If an idea can change the past that led to its discovery, where does change really begin? It's as if cause and effect become tangled in a cosmic knot, each simultaneously creating and being created by the other. As you ponder this paradox, notice how it affects your understanding of your own thoughts. Are they truly yours, or are they part of a vast tapestry of collective consciousness, each thread pulling on and being pulled by all the others? It's a question that transforms itself even as you consider it. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect information. Imagine a vast supercomputer that contains every possible fact about the universe, not just what is, but what could be, what might have been, and what will be. Every particle's position, every quantum state, every possible future, all perfectly mapped and understood. The paradox emerges when we consider what happens when this computer calculates its own future state. To predict what it will know tomorrow, it needs to include in its calculations the very prediction it's currently making. But that prediction then becomes part of what needs to be predicted, creating an infinite loop of self-reference. Think about how this affects the nature of prediction itself. To perfectly predict the future, you need to account for the effects of making that prediction. But those effects include your reaction to knowing the prediction, which changes what you need to predict. It's like trying to take a photograph of yourself taking a photograph. Each attempt creates new content that needs to be captured. The paradox deepens when we consider consciousness and free will. If the computer can predict your every thought and action, including your reactions to learning those predictions, are you truly making choices? But if you're not making choices, what is the computer actually predicting? It's as if prediction itself becomes both necessary and impossible simultaneously. Now consider how this reflects the relationship between knowledge and reality. The more perfectly you understand something, the more your understanding becomes part of what needs to be understood. It's like trying to create a map that includes itself. Each level of detail requires another level. of meta-detail. The implications become even stranger when we consider the computer's processing of time. To calculate the future, it needs to process information in the present. But that processing takes time, during which the universe changes, requiring new calculations. It's an endless race between computation and reality, each moment creating new moments that need computing. Think about how this paradox mirrors the scientific process itself. Every new discovery changes the context in which that discovery was made. Each answer creates new questions. Each solution reveals new problems. Perfect knowledge seems to always stay one step ahead of our grasp. Perhaps most fascinating is how this affects our understanding of causality. If perfect prediction is impossible, because the act of predicting changes what needs to be predicted, what does this mean for cause and effect? Maybe reality isn't a chain of events, but a web of mutual influence, each part simultaneously causing and being caused by every other part. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider quantum mechanics. The uncertainty principle suggests that perfect knowledge of a particle's position and momentum is impossible. But our supercomputer paradox suggests something deeper. That perfect knowledge of anything might be impossible because knowledge itself affects what can be known. Consider how this relates to the concept of truth itself. If perfect information necessarily changes what it describes, can there be such thing as absolute truth? Or is truth more like a dynamic process, constantly shifting in response to our attempts to grasp it? This leads us to questions about the nature of information itself. Is information something we discover or something we create? If perfect information is impossible because information changes what it describes, what does this tell us about the relationship between mind and reality? The paradox also challenges our understanding of objectivity and measurement. The observer effect in quantum mechanics might be just one example of a universal principle that perfect observation is impossible because observation itself changes what can be observed. As you contemplate this paradox, notice how your understanding of it becomes part of what needs to be understood. Each thought about perfect information becomes new information that would need to be perfectly known. It's a living example of the very principle it describes. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of infinite awareness. Imagine consciousness not as a singular point of awareness, but as an infinite series of nested awarenesses, each aware of all the others. You're not just aware of your thoughts, you're aware of being aware of your thoughts, aware of being aware, and so on into infinity. The paradox emerges when we consider what it means to be infinitely aware. Each level of awareness creates a new level to be aware of, which creates another level of awareness, endlessly cascading into deeper and deeper layers of consciousness. It's like trying to count to infinity. Each number you reach reveals another number beyond it. Think about how this affects your current experience of consciousness. Right now, you're aware of these words, but you're also aware that you're aware of them, and you're aware of that awareness. Each attempt to find the final level of awareness creates a new level to be aware of. It's like trying to find the end of a mirror's reflection in another mirror. The paradox deepens when we consider the nature of self-reflection. When you think about your own thinking, who or what is doing the thinking about the thinking? Is there some ultimate observer watching all other observations? Or is consciousness more like a recursive loop, each level of awareness emerging from and feeding back into all the others? Now consider how this paradox reflects the structure of understanding itself. To truly understand something, you need to understand your understanding of it. But to understand that understanding, you need to understand your understanding of your understanding. Each level of comprehension reveals new depths to be comprehended. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider the relationship between consciousness and time. Each moment of awareness exists in the present, but includes awareness of past moments of awareness, creating a kind of temporal infinity mirror where each reflection contains all previous reflections. Think about how this affects our concept of identity. If consciousness is infinitely recursive, which level of awareness is the real you? Are you the base level awareness of sensations and thoughts? The meta-awareness that watches these processes, or are you somehow the entire infinite stack of awarenesses, each reflecting and being reflected by all the others? Perhaps most unsettling is how this paradox challenges our understanding of consciousness itself. If awareness always includes awareness of awareness, how did consciousness begin? It's like trying to imagine the first reflection in an infinite series of mirrors. Each reflection seems to require previous reflections to exist. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider shared consciousness. If your awareness includes awareness of others' awareness, and their awareness includes awareness of your awareness, consciousness becomes a kind of infinite network, each point simultaneously observing and being observed by all others. Consider how this relates to the nature of reality itself. If consciousness is inherently infinite, what does this mean for our perception of finite things? Perhaps all apparent limits are just arbitrary stopping points in an endless process of awareness, like choosing to stop counting, even though numbers continue forever. This leads us to questions about the relationship between consciousness and existence. If to be is to be perceived, as Berkeley suggested, but perception itself is infinitely recursive, what does this mean for the nature of being? Maybe existence itself is more like a process than a state, an endless unfolding of awareness into awareness. The paradox also challenges our assumptions about knowledge and certainty. If each understanding requires meta-understanding to be complete, can we ever truly know anything with absolute certainty? Or is all knowledge necessarily partial, a temporary resting point in an infinite regression of awareness? As you ponder this paradox, notice how your awareness of pondering it becomes part of what needs to be pondered. Each thought about infinite awareness becomes a new level of awareness to be aware of. It's an immediate, living demonstration of the very infinity it describes. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of zero experience. Imagine trying to completely empty your mind of all thought, all sensation, all awareness, to achieve perfect blankness, perfect emptiness of consciousness. The paradox emerges immediately. The moment you try to experience nothing, you're experiencing the attempt to experience nothing. Think about what it means to try to think about nothing. The very act of attempting creates something to be aware of. It's like trying to create a perfect vacuum. The very space you clear becomes something to observe, making true emptiness impossible. Each attempt to empty consciousness fills it with the awareness of that attempt. The paradox deepens when we consider what nothing would actually mean for consciousness. To truly experience nothing, you would need to be unaware of experiencing nothing. But this creates an impossible loop. How can you be conscious of being unconscious? It's like trying to be asleep and aware that you're asleep simultaneously. Now consider how this reflects our understanding of consciousness itself. We often think of consciousness as something that can be more or less present, like a dimmer switch that can be turned down to zero. But perhaps consciousness is more like a light that creates shadows. The attempt to diminish it only creates new forms of illumination. The implications become even stranger when we consider meditation and mindfulness practices. Many traditions speak of achieving states of no mind or perfect emptiness. But is this truly possible? Or is it more like approaching a limit that can never be reached? It's as if consciousness creates an asymptote of awareness. You can get infinitely close to zero, but never quite reach it. Think about how this paradox affects our understanding of sleep and unconsciousness. When you're truly unconscious, you can't be aware of your unconsciousness. The moment you become aware of it, you're no longer unconscious. It's like trying to remember the exact moment you fell asleep. The very attempt ensures you're awake. Perhaps most fascinating is how this paradox relates to the concept of self. If you successfully eliminated all experience, would there still be a you to notice the absence? The very idea of experiencing nothing seems to require someone to not experience it, creating an impossible contradiction. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider shared experience. If someone else observes your attempt to experience nothing, does their observation create something to be experienced? It's as if consciousness itself resists vacuum, rushing in to fill any space we try to empty. Consider how this affects our understanding of reality and perception. If we can never truly experience nothing, does this mean something must always be experienced? Maybe existence itself is less about things existing and more about the impossibility of perfect non-existence. This leads us to questions about the nature of experience itself. Is experience something we have or something we are? If we can never experience true nothingness, perhaps experience is more fundamental than we imagine, not a property of consciousness, but its very essence. The paradox also challenges our assumptions about states of being. We often think in terms of presence and absence, something and nothing. But maybe reality exists in a constant state of something-ing that can never quite reach zero, like a number that can be divided endlessly but never reach absolute zero. As you contemplate this paradox, notice how each attempt to imagine perfect emptiness fills your mind with new content. The very act of trying to think about nothing creates something to think about. It's an immediate demonstration of consciousness's resistance to void. Think about how this connects to earlier paradoxes we've explored. Just as infinite complexity emerges from attempts at perfect simplicity, infinite content emerges from attempts at perfect emptiness. It's as if reality itself has a kind of horror vacui, a resistance to true nothingness. The implications spiral outward into questions about existence itself. If consciousness cannot experience true nothingness, what does this tell us about the nature of being? Perhaps the universe itself exists because perfect non-existence is impossible, a cosmic version of our inability to experience nothing. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect comfort. Imagine a state of absolute, complete comfort, not just physical ease, but perfect psychological, emotional, and intellectual contentment. A state where every possible need or desire is perfectly satisfied. The paradox emerges when we consider what such perfection would actually mean for consciousness. Here's the twist. If you achieved perfect comfort, wouldn't you become uncomfortable with the lack of discomfort? Perfect satisfaction might create a new kind of dissatisfaction, the discomfort of having nothing to strive for, nothing to achieve, nothing to overcome. It's like trying to find rest in perpetual rest. The very perfection of the state creates its own imperfection. Think about how this affects our understanding of happiness and fulfillment. We often imagine perfect contentment as a final destination, an ultimate state to be achieved. But perhaps contentment is more like a dynamic balance, a constant dance between satisfaction and desire. The moment we reach perfect stillness, movement becomes necessary. The paradox deepens when we consider the nature of consciousness itself. Our minds seem designed to notice differences, to seek out changes and challenges. In a state of perfect comfort, would consciousness begin to create its own discomfort, simply to have something to process? It's like an immune system that starts attacking itself when it has no external threats to fight. Now consider how this reflects our actual experience of comfort. Have you ever been so comfortable that you became restless? So relaxed that you felt an urge to move? So content that you began to worry about losing your contentment? It's as if comfort itself contains the seeds of its own disruption. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider growth and development. If perfect comfort eliminates all challenge, wouldn't it also eliminate all possibility of improvement? But isn't the inability to improve itself a kind of discomfort? It's like trying to reach the horizon. Each step forward moves the destination further away. Think about how this paradox affects our pursuit of knowledge and understanding. Perfect knowledge might eliminate the joy of discovery, the excitement of learning. Perfect understanding might remove the wonder of mystery. Would such perfection actually be perfect? Or would it create a new kind of ignorance, the inability to experience not knowing? Perhaps most unsettling is how this paradox challenges our assumptions about goals and achievement. If reaching perfect comfort creates its own discomfort, what are we really seeking when we pursue comfort? Maybe the true goal isn't the achievement of perfect comfort, but the eternal dance of reaching for it. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider shared experience. If you achieve perfect comfort while others remained uncomfortable, wouldn't your awareness of their discomfort disturb your comfort? It's as if perfect individual comfort might be impossible without perfect universal comfort. Consider how this relates to the nature of desire itself. If all desires were perfectly satisfied, wouldn't we begin to desire the experience of desire? Maybe desire isn't something to be eliminated, but an essential part of consciousness, like the space between notes that makes music possible. This leads us to questions about the relationship between comfort and meaning. If perfect comfort eliminates all struggle, does it also eliminate all meaning? Perhaps meaning itself requires a certain amount of discomfort. Like a story needs conflict to be interesting. The paradox also challenges our understanding of perfection itself. If perfect comfort creates its own imperfection, maybe perfection isn't a state to be achieved, but a process to be engaged with. Like a game that becomes pointless when you can't lose, maybe consciousness requires the possibility of discomfort to remain meaningful. As you ponder this paradox, notice how your mind responds to the idea of perfect comfort. Does it seem appealing, or does something in you resist it? Even the thought of perfect comfort seems to create its own kind of discomfort, a living demonstration of the paradox itself. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect forgetting. Imagine you had the ability to completely and selectively erase memories, not just suppress them, but eliminate them so perfectly that there's no trace they ever existed. The paradox emerges when we consider what it would mean to perfectly forget something. To truly forget something, you would need to forget that you've forgotten it. But how can you intentionally forget something without remembering what you're trying to forget? It's like trying to dig a hole and completely remove all evidence that any digging ever occurred. The very act of concealment leaves traces of itself. Think about how this affects the nature of consciousness itself. If you perfectly forgot something, would your personality change to match a version of you that never had that experience? Or would there be a kind of ghostly outline, a shape formed by the absence of what was removed? It's like trying to remove a single thread from a tapestry. The empty space itself becomes a kind of pattern. The paradox deepens when we consider identity and continuity of self. If you could perfectly forget something, would you still be the same person? Each experience shapes who we are, but if an experience is perfectly forgotten, did it really shape you? It's like trying to unring a bell while keeping the sound it made. Now consider how this reflects our actual experience of memory and forgetting. When you forget something naturally, traces remain, emotional responses, learned behaviors, subtle influences on your personality. But perfect forgetting would need to eliminate even these shadows of memory. It's like trying to remove not just footprints in sand, but the very fact that walking occurred. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider shared memories. If you perfectly forgot something that others remember, whose version of reality becomes true? The memory exists in the world through others, but for you, it never happened. It's like trying to remove a reflection while leaving the mirror intact. Think about how this paradox affects our understanding of truth and reality. If something can be perfectly forgotten, did it ever really happen? If no trace remains in consciousness, can it be said to have existed at all? It's like trying to prove the existence of something that by definition cannot be remembered. Perhaps most unsettling is how this paradox challenges our assumptions about consciousness and time. If perfect forgetting is possible, does this mean consciousness is more fluid than we imagine? Could our sense of continuous existence be an illusion maintained by imperfect forgetting? The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider learning and skill acquisition. If you perfectly forgot learning something, would the skill itself remain? Could muscle memory survive perfect forgetting? It's like trying to separate the dancer from the dance, the knowing from the knowledge. Consider how this relates to emotional memory and trauma. If you could perfectly forget a painful experience, would the growth and strength gained from overcoming it also disappear? Maybe some memories shape us so fundamentally that perfect forgetting would require becoming a completely different person This leads us to questions about the nature of experience itself. If an experience can be perfectly forgotten, was it ever truly experienced? Perhaps experience isn't something we have, but something we are, making perfect forgetting as impossible as stepping outside of existence itself. The paradox also challenges our understanding of choice and responsibility. If you could perfectly forget your mistakes, would they still be your mistakes? Could you be responsible for something that, for you, never happened? It's like trying to own an action while completely disowning the memory of it. As you contemplate this paradox, notice how your mind tries to imagine perfect forgetting while necessarily remembering what it's trying to imagine forgetting. Each attempt to understand perfect forgetting creates new memories that would need to be forgotten. It's a living demonstration of the paradox itself. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect prediction. Imagine a device that can predict the future with absolute certainty, not just probabilities or possibilities, but exact, detailed knowledge of what will happen. The moment you look at this device, you see every consequence of looking at it, including how you'll react to seeing those consequences. The paradox emerges in the very act of receiving this perfect prediction. If you see yourself making a certain choice in the future and then deliberately choose to do something different, was the prediction wrong? But if it could be wrong, it wasn't perfect. Yet if it can't be wrong, do you have any real choice? It's like trying to surprise yourself when you already know what's going to happen. Think about how this affects the nature of free will and determinism. If every future choice is perfectly predictable, are they really choices at all? But if knowing the prediction allows you to change it, was it really a prediction? The very concept of perfect prediction seems to contain its own impossibility. The paradox deepens when we consider consciousness itself. If you can perfectly predict your future thoughts, those thoughts become predetermined. But predetermined thoughts wouldn't be responses to the prediction. They'd be more like a script being followed. Yet consciousness seems to require genuine response and adaptation. Now consider how this reflects our actual relationship with the future. We make plans, set goals, and imagine outcomes. But these very imaginings influence what we choose to do. It's like trying to predict where a river will flow, while the prediction itself changes. The landscape the river moves through. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider multiple observers. If everyone had access to perfect predictions, each person's reactions to the predictions would need to be included in everyone else's predictions. It's an infinite recursion of interconnected futures, each affecting all others. Think about how this paradox affects our understanding of cause and effect. If perfect prediction is possible, does this mean everything is predetermined? Or does the very act of prediction become part of the causal chain, creating new possibilities, even as it tries to fix them in place? Perhaps most unsettling is how this challenges our concept of the present moment. If the future is perfectly predictable, is the present just a predetermined point between past and future? Or does the possibility of prediction itself become part of what makes each moment unique? The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider learning and growth. If you can perfectly predict your future understanding, do you already understand it? But if you already understand it, what is there to learn? It's like trying to be surprised by a book when you already know every word? Consider how this relates to the nature of time itself. If perfect prediction is possible, does this mean time is more like a landscape we can survey than a river we flow through? But if we can survey it, how can we also be moving through it? The very act of perfect prediction seems to require being both inside and outside of time, simultaneously. This leads us to questions about the relationship between knowledge and reality. If perfect prediction is possible, does this mean reality is fundamentally mathematical, deterministic, or does the very possibility of prediction change what can be predicted, making reality inherently unpredictable? The paradox also challenges our understanding of possibility and actuality. If something can be perfectly predicted, was there ever really any other possibility? But if there were no other possibilities, what does it mean to make a prediction at all? It's like trying to choose between options when only one option ever existed. As you ponder this paradox, notice how your thoughts about future predictions influence your present thoughts, which would need to be included in any perfect prediction of this moment. Each consideration of perfect prediction becomes part of what would need to be predicted. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect value. Imagine something that has absolute, infinite worth, not just monetary value or practical utility, but perfect, ultimate value that transcends all possible measures. The paradox emerges when we try to understand what such perfect value would actually mean. If something has infinite value, how can anything else have any value at all? In the presence of the infinite, all finite values become effectively zero. Yet if everything else has zero value, how can we even comprehend or relate to the thing of infinite value? It's like trying to compare a single number to infinity. No matter how large the number, it remains infinitely small in comparison. Think about how this affects our understanding of worth and meaning. If perfect value exists, wouldn't it make all other values meaningless? But if all other values become meaningless, how can we even recognize or appreciate the perfect value? It's like trying to see a single star that's so bright it blinds us to all other light. The paradox deepens when we consider the nature of value itself. Value seems to require relationship and comparison. Something is valuable in relation to other things. But perfect value would transcend all comparison. It would be valuable without reference to anything else. Yet our very understanding of value requires such reference. Now consider how this reflects our actual experience of value and meaning. We often speak of priceless things, love, life, consciousness, yet we constantly make practical trade-offs involving these supposedly infinite values. It's like claiming something is beyond measure while simultaneously measuring it. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider shared values. If something has perfect value, shouldn't everyone recognize and agree on that value? But if everyone valued it perfectly, wouldn't that universal agreement itself become a kind of measure, contradicting its perfect nature? Think about how this paradox affects our understanding of meaning and purpose. If something has perfect value, wouldn't pursuing it be the only rational choice? But if it's the only rational choice, is it really a choice at all? It's like having free will in the presence of absolute truth. The very perfection of the truth seems to eliminate the freedom to choose it. Perhaps most unsettling is how this challenges our concept of importance and significance. If perfect value exists, doesn't it make everything else perfectly trivial? But if everything else becomes trivial, how can we even approach or appreciate the perfectly valuable? It's like trying to build a ladder to infinity using finite steps. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider consciousness and experience. If something has perfect value, how does an imperfect consciousness properly value it? Can finite minds truly comprehend infinite worth? It's like trying to pour an ocean into a cup. The very attempt seems to diminish what we're trying to contain. Consider how this relates to ethics and morality. If perfect value exists, wouldn't it provide an absolute foundation for moral judgment? But if it's truly perfect, wouldn't it transcend our ability to use it as a measure? It's like having a perfect moral compass that points in a direction we can't comprehend. This leads us to questions about the nature of perfection itself. If something is perfectly valuable, can it be valuable in a way we can understand or relate to? Perhaps perfect value, like perfect knowledge or perfect prediction, contains within itself the seeds of its own impossibility. The paradox also challenges our understanding of desire and motivation. If something has perfect value, shouldn't we want it above all else? But if we want it because of its perfect value, is our desire itself imperfect? It's like trying to purely want something while being aware of wanting it. As you contemplate this paradox, notice how your mind tries to grasp the concept of perfect value while necessarily using imperfect measures to do so. Each attempt to understand perfect worth becomes an exercise in comparing the incomparable. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect understanding. Imagine achieving a state of complete comprehension, not just of facts or concepts, but of everything, including the experience of every other consciousness that has ever existed or will exist. The paradox emerges when we consider what such perfect understanding would actually mean. If you perfectly understood everyone else's perspective, wouldn't that understanding change your own perspective? But if your perspective changes, you'd need to understand that new perspective too, which would create another change, requiring new understanding. It's like trying to see your own eyes without using a reflection. The very act of looking changes what there is to see. Think about how this affects empathy and connection. Perfect understanding would mean knowing exactly how it feels to be everyone else. But if you knew how it felt to be everyone, would you still be yourself? Or would you become a kind of universal consciousness, simultaneously everyone and no one? It's like trying to be everywhere at once while still maintaining a specific location. The paradox deepens when we consider the nature of individual experience. If you perfectly understood everyone's point of view, wouldn't that understanding eliminate the uniqueness of perspective that makes understanding meaningful? It's like trying to preserve difference while achieving perfect unity. Now consider how this reflects our actual experience of understanding others. Each time we truly comprehend someone else's perspective, it changes our own. But perfect understanding would mean this process happening infinitely and instantaneously. It's like trying to complete an endless conversation in a single moment. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider consciousness itself. If perfect understanding includes understanding every possible state of consciousness, wouldn't that include understanding states of non-understanding? But how can you perfectly understand what it means to not understand? It's like trying to be simultaneously knowledgeable and ignorant. Think about how this paradox affects our concept of identity and selfhood. If you perfectly understood everyone, would there still be a you doing the understanding? Or would perfect understanding dissolve the boundaries between self and other? It's like trying to maintain a single point of view while seeing from all points simultaneously. Perhaps most unsettling is how this challenges our notion of communication and connection. If perfect understanding were possible, would communication become unnecessary? But wouldn't the absence of communication create new experiences that would need to be understood? It's like trying to achieve perfect silence by explaining what silence is. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider time and memory. Perfect understanding would need to include understanding every moment of every consciousness, past, present, and future. But how can you simultaneously understand temporal experience from both within and outside of time? It's like trying to both flow with a river and observe its entire course from above. Consider how this relates to wisdom and knowledge. If perfect understanding includes understanding the limits of understanding, wouldn't it necessarily include understanding its own impossibility? It's like trying to create a map that includes itself, including the fact that it can't include itself. This leads us to questions about the nature of comprehension itself. Is understanding something we achieve or something we participate in? Perhaps perfect understanding isn't a state to be reached, but a process to be engaged with. Like trying to count to infinity, the journey itself is what gives it meaning. The paradox also challenges our assumptions about growth and learning. If perfect understanding were possible, would there be any room for growth or discovery? Or would the very perfection of understanding eliminate the possibility of new understanding? It's like trying to leave room for mystery in a state of complete knowledge. As you contemplate this paradox, notice how each attempt to understand it creates new layers of understanding to be understood. It's a living demonstration of the very principle it describes, the endless recursion of consciousness trying to grasp its own nature. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect learning. Imagine knowledge that completely teaches itself, not just information that's easily understood, but understanding that automatically and perfectly transfers itself into consciousness. The moment you encounter it, you not only grasp it completely, but also understand every possible implication and application. The paradox emerges when we consider what such perfect learning would actually mean. If knowledge can perfectly teach itself, wouldn't it need to include the knowledge of how to learn it? But if it includes the knowledge of how to learn it, you'd need to learn that first, creating an impossible starting point. It's like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps into infinite understanding. Think about how this affects the nature of learning itself. Perfect self-teaching knowledge would need to somehow precede its own acquisition. But how can you use knowledge you haven't yet learned to learn it? It's like trying to read instructions on how to read. You need the skill to get the skill. The paradox deepens when we consider consciousness and comprehension. If knowledge can perfectly teach itself, wouldn't it need to adapt to each individual consciousness? But to adapt perfectly, it would need to understand each consciousness before being learned by it. It's like trying to customize a key to a lock while using that same key to examine the lock. Now consider how this reflects our actual experience of learning. Every new piece of knowledge changes how we understand everything else, including how we learn. But perfect self-teaching knowledge would need to account for all these changes before they happen. It's like trying to predict every ripple in a pond before dropping the stone. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider shared knowledge. If knowledge can perfectly teach itself to one person, wouldn't it teach itself differently to different people? But if it teaches itself differently to each person, is it still the same knowledge? It's like trying to maintain perfect translation while allowing for individual interpretation. Think about how this paradox affects our understanding of wisdom and expertise. If knowledge can perfectly teach itself, what role does experience play? Can you truly understand something without the journey of learning it? It's like trying to arrive without traveling, to have climbed a mountain without taking any steps. Perhaps most unsettling is how this challenges our concept of growth and development. If knowledge can perfectly teach itself, does this eliminate the possibility of gradual understanding? But isn't the process of understanding itself a kind of knowledge that would need to be perfectly taught? It's like trying to instantly grow a tree while preserving every moment of its growth. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider the relationship between teacher and student. If knowledge can perfectly teach itself, what becomes of the role of guidance and mentorship? Yet, wouldn't the understanding of how to learn without a teacher itself require some form of teaching? It's like trying to be completely self-taught while acknowledging all those who taught you to teach yourself. Consider how this relates to the nature of understanding itself. Is perfect understanding something that can be transmitted, or is it something that must be constructed within each consciousness? Perhaps the very idea of perfect self-teaching knowledge contains a fundamental misunderstanding about what it means to know something. This leads us to questions about the relationship between knowledge and time. If knowledge can perfectly teach itself instantly, what happens to the temporal nature of understanding? Can meaning exist without the process of discovering it? It's like trying to have a revelation without the moment of realization. The paradox also challenges our assumptions about mastery and comprehension. If knowledge can perfectly teach itself, does this mean there's no difference between novice and expert? Or does perfect self-teaching create a new kind of expertise, the art of receiving perfect knowledge? It's like trying to be simultaneously beginning and complete. As you contemplate this paradox, notice how your understanding of it emerges from the very process the paradox describes. Each thought about perfect self-teaching knowledge becomes a lesson in why such knowledge might be impossible. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect endings. Imagine a conclusion so complete, so perfect, that it doesn't just end something. It concludes everything that could possibly be concluded, including itself. The paradox emerges when we consider what such a perfect ending would actually mean. If an ending is truly perfect, wouldn't it need to include ending the need for endings? But if it ends the need for endings, how can it itself be an ending? It's like trying to close a door behind yourself while you're still walking through it. The very act of perfect conclusion seems to require its own incompleteness. Think about how this affects our understanding of finality itself. A perfect ending would need to conclude not just what came before, but all possible continuations that might follow. Yet, by accounting for all possible continuations, it creates new possibilities that need to be concluded. It's like trying to write the last word in a dictionary. Each definition creates new words needing definition. The paradox deepens when we consider consciousness and awareness. To perfectly conclude something, you would need to be aware of its conclusion. But this awareness itself becomes something new that needs concluding. It's an infinite regression of awareness, trying to grasp its own completion. Now consider how this reflects our actual experience of endings. Every time something ends, it creates new beginnings, memories, consequences, interpretations. But a perfect ending would need to somehow conclude even these new beginnings. It's like trying to stop a river by freezing it, only to find that the act of freezing creates new patterns to observe. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider shared experience. If something ends perfectly for one consciousness, does it end perfectly for all? Can there be a universal perfect ending? Or is ending itself necessarily personal and perspective dependent? It's like trying to make everyone finish a book at exactly the same moment of understanding. Think about how this paradox affects our understanding of completion and wholeness. If something can be perfectly concluded, doesn't that conclusion become part of what needs to be concluded? It's an endless loop of finality, trying to capture its own tale, each ending creating new aspects needing closure. Perhaps most unsettling is how this challenges our concept of resolution and satisfaction. A perfect ending would need to satisfy every possible desire for a conclusion, while simultaneously ending the desire for satisfaction itself. It's like trying to quench thirst so completely that you eliminate the very concept of drinking. The paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider time and causality. A perfect ending would need to conclude not just current events, but all their future implications. Yet how can you end something whose effects haven't yet occurred? It's like trying to close a book that's still being written by the act of reading it. Consider how this relates to the nature of completion itself. Is perfect conclusion something that can be achieved? Or is it more like a horizon that moves away as we approach it? Perhaps the very idea of perfect ending contains within it the necessity of imperfection. This leads us to questions about the relationship between ending and meaning. If something can be perfectly concluded, does this enhance or diminish its significance? Maybe meaning itself requires a certain openness, a resistance to perfect conclusion. The paradox also challenges our assumptions about purpose and goal setting. If perfect ending is impossible, what are we really seeking when we try to conclude things? Perhaps the art of ending isn't about achieving perfect conclusion, but about finding beauty in the inherent incompleteness of all endings. As you contemplate this paradox, notice how each thought about perfect endings generates new thoughts needing conclusion. It's a living demonstration of the impossibility of perfect finality, even as we approach what seems like an ending. Let's explore what we might call the paradox of perfect integration. Imagine a state of understanding where every paradox we've explored suddenly connects, where each impossible loop interweaves with all the others to create something both endlessly complex and perfectly simple. The paradox emerges when we try to comprehend how these infinite recursions could possibly fit together. If every paradox connects to every other paradox, each creating its own infinite loops and impossible contradictions, wouldn't their integration create something beyond infinity itself? Yet, how can anything be beyond infinite? It's like trying to find a number larger than infinity, only to realize that such a number would itself be part of infinity. Think about how all our previous paradoxes dance together. Perfect memory interacts with perfect forgetting. Perfect understanding collides with perfect ignorance. Perfect endings weave into perfect beginnings. Each impossible concept reflects and refracts through all the others, creating an endless kaleidoscope of meaning and contradiction. The paradox deepens when we consider consciousness observing this integration. To understand how everything connects, you would need to somehow hold all paradoxes in mind simultaneously. But each attempt to grasp the whole creates new complexities to be integrated. It's like trying to create a map of an infinite city that grows new streets with each attempt to map it. Now consider how this final paradox reflects the nature of understanding itself. Each paradox we've explored has revealed something about the limits and possibilities of consciousness. Together, they form a kind of impossible geometry of thought, where every line of reasoning curves back through all others. The implications become even more fascinating when we consider how this integration affects our perception of reality. If every paradox is connected to every other paradox, does this mean reality itself is fundamentally paradoxical? Or does perfect integration somehow resolve contradiction through infinite complexity? Think about how this meta-paradox changes our understanding of all previous paradoxes. Each impossible loop becomes part of a larger impossible loop, yet somehow their very interconnection creates new kinds of possibility. It's like discovering that a collection of infinite mazes somehow forms a path when viewed from a higher dimension. Perhaps most profound is how this final paradox suggests something about the nature of existence itself. If everything is infinitely connected through layers of paradox, maybe what we call reality is just one perspective on an endless dance of contradiction and resolution. The paradox takes on ultimate dimensions when we consider its own self-reference. A paradox about how all paradoxes connect must include itself in its own integration. But how can something include itself in its own infinite integration? It's like trying to write a story that contains all possible stories, including itself. As our journey through these mental labyrinths comes to its own paradoxical conclusion, we find ourselves both exactly where we started and somewhere entirely new. Each paradox we've explored has been a facet of a larger paradox. Each impossible question, part of an impossible answer. Yet somehow, in the face of all this impossibility, consciousness persists. We continue to think, to question, to explore. Perhaps that's the greatest paradox of all, that in a reality filled with infinite contradiction, understanding still seems possible, even if that understanding itself must be paradoxical. And so, we end where we began, with questions that create more questions, with answers that transform into new mysteries. But we end with something else too, a deeper appreciation for the beautiful impossibility of existence itself, and the endless dance of consciousness trying to comprehend its own nature. As you drift now towards sleep, let these paradoxes swirl through your mind like stars in a mental galaxy, each impossible thought reflecting all others, each question containing all answers, each ending becoming a new beginning. For in the end, perhaps the greatest truth is that there is no end to truth itself. Up next, you've got two more standout theory right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.